picture. Share screen. Are we okay? Come on here. Share, it says. Now, can you see the first slide, the farm?
Yes.
Hear me all right? Okay. Good evening. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me into your webinar, and hope that I can spark some interest about regenerative agriculture and how important it is to use cover crops to curb erosion, bring nutrients to the surface to reduce the amount of nutrients that you would not have to purchase, and make your farming operation more profitable. This first slide here is a picture of our farmstead, and we farm about 964 acres. We're in a corn, soybean, wheat rotation, approximately a third of each crop each year. Makes it easy for me to know which goes in the year following. If it's a cornfield, it will go to soybeans. If it's a soybean, it's going to be planted into a small grain in the fall. After small grain is harvested, we'll put cover crops in, and we'll show you some pictures later on about that. This is a December picture of our farm, so you can see how green it is around our base of operation, and our neighbors are still conventional tilling. I haven't made an inroad there yet, but I think everybody's still watching to see if it's going to work really well for us. We also sell cover crop seeds, and the big building at the bottom of the picture in the center is our brand new cleaning facilities. We have a clipper cleaner, and we can clean about 400 to 500 bushel of seed an hour with it, and process it to as a custom cleaning business, or process our own seeds that we grow. I began using no-till and cover crop. I began no-till. My first field of no-till was in 1969. I was 100% no-till in 1971. In 78, we started our first cover crops, and it was Austrian winter pea, like you see here, planted after wheat, mainly to conserve the soil. I'm not thinking about what we could do with it today. All we want to do is keep the erosion down. About 85% of our 900 acres are marked highly erodible. We run from about 2% slope up to 20% slopes in some of our fields. So that's why I became interested in using cover crops, and winter peas seem to be a good thing to go in there because they capture organic nitrogen from the atmosphere and put that in nodulation form in the soils that will be available for next year's corn crop. And here is a picture of the Austrian winter pea. And what I want to try to show you is it tends to have a tap root. There's a pin there beside it. The root's about as big as a ballpoint pin. But if you look at the top surface, you'll find some nodulation at the surface, which really works well for young seedling corn coming up. Their roots will grow into these nodules and have lots of nitrogen. When the corn's about knee high, you'll see it here in the center of the picture, about 2.5 to 3 to 4 inches deep. That's where we'll pick up the majority of the nitrogen to establish yield, keep the plant green. And then at 9 inches down, we still have the nodulation in the soil. And this is when the corn plant usually taps into it, like in August. And that's when we get grain fill and test weight. Most of our corns are tested between 58 to 61 pounds per bushel, which is a little better than some of our neighbors' corn when we talk to our neighbors. We really like this plant really well, and we used it probably 30 years before we understood that we could do more than one species at a time. Another clover that I like really well is crimson clover. It's not like the red clover. It doesn't have a ball with a red bloom. This tends to have a spike about 2.5 to 3 inches tall. It's a very beautiful clover. It seems to put on more nitrogen than red clover does, and that's why we utilize it so much. Very easy to establish. Seems to be somewhat winter hardy. We've not had too many failures with it as far as not coming through the winter. Hairy vetch is our primary legume that we're using. It grows about anywhere. It makes a really nice ground cover and it's shallow rooted, puts a lot of nitrogen in the soil, and really nice to plant through as long as you don't have row cleaners or spike closing wheels or things hanging down that'll wrap on, because it will wrap on things if you plant it green. We've learned how to do our corn planting green, so everything on our farm we plant green. We have utilized all these years and figured out that we can do this a little later in the season and still maintain higher yields of corn. This happens to be what it looks like in the spring. This would be rye. You can see the bloom of the hairy vetch. If we was closer there, you can see some crimson clover in there. And this represents about 32,000 pounds of green biomass. And converts into about 2,400 to 2,600 pounds of carbon. And we are now capturing carbon. Well, we've been capturing carbon for years, but we are now selling carbon credits, which is another way that we have utilized our cover crops to make us more profitable. Over the years, we've learned to use blends. This happens to be a 10-way blended cover crop. We use sunflowers in there to bring beneficial insects. For 10 years, we've not used any fungicides or insecticides on our farm. For the last 5 years, we've been planting what I call naked seed. None of our seed has seed treatment on them. We just don't seem to need it with all the beneficials. If you're here in the summertime and look around, you'll find about 3,350 beneficial insects in a sweep net, and only about 6 or 8 harmful ones. So we have enough beneficials that actually keeps our unbeneficial insect population down, and we don't have trouble with it in anything that we're growing. At planting time in the spring, this was what's left after a 10-way blend that we're using now. So there's actually 4 species or 5 species here. And you'll see the crimson clover, which is the red blooms. You'll see the hairy vetch, which is the purple. You'll see rye here, and the heads of rye, and they're starting to bloom. And then the white is Balanza clover. And that's a clover we found 3 years ago that tends to grow really well in damp soils. It seems to be a clover that can tolerate a lot of water in the root system, where the rye and the hairy vetch will not. So it really has made a good mix of covers to put together. When we can plant into this and roll it with our crop roller, we do not need to use a herbicide or insecticides, and we use very little nitrogen, maybe only 20 pounds of nitrogen per acre to get 180 to 200 bushel corn. In the 80s and 90s, when I was looking at single species, I went to the university and I asked them, how much nitrogen will our plants collect so that I could credit to the corn? And the professor I was working with at Ohio State says, the only thing I know to tell you to do, David, you have to bury the tops of that to get the nitrogen out of the plant. Well, I made the decision I wasn't going to plow it under or work it in. I wanted to be on surface to hold back the erosion. So I run a test for 5 years, planted 10 acres of each one of these species by themselves, went in and planted corn into them, had nitrogen rates from 200 pounds to 0. Wherever the corn plant yielded the 200 bushel an acre, whatever the yield was that year. I figured that was the amount of nitrogen that those plants could accumulate. So this was a 5-year study, and this was the average of these plants for 5 years. So if we look at red clover, my math said it put about 60 pounds of nitrogen in the soil. If we look at sweet clover, about 80 pounds. If we look at crimson clover, about 75 pounds. Hairy vetch is 150. Cahaba vetch or chickling vetch about 30. The things I found about Cahaba vetch or chickling vetch is it tends to bloom in about 30 days, and then it moves the nitrogen that it has accumulated in the soil to make seed set. So that's why the vetch had made seed pods by the time I planted corn. So I didn't get as many pounds of nitrogen from that. If we plant it later so it doesn't go to bloom, I think it'll produce more nitrogen. If we look at winter peas, we found 125 pounds of nitrogen from them. We looked at some warm season legumes such as cowpeas and sunhip in the last 5 years and found that was a nitrogen we could count for that. So as we look at losing cover crops to build nitrogen in the soil, we look at sunhip and cowpeas as our warm season legumes. We look at winter peas, hairy vetch, and crimson clover. So if you could do some fast math there, that's about 400 pounds of nitrogen we might be able to accumulate in the soil for the next year's corn crop. Now, not all of that's going to be available the first year. So there's a pretty good bunch of it is. So that's why we cut our rates down to about 20 pounds an acre. In some years we use none, you know. Again, this is our 10-way species with the sunflowers in it. We started using sunflowers 5 years ago because we would plant this without sunflowers, and in August or September, some of our conventional neighbors would go to our landlords and say, man, Mr. Brandt's got a green mess out there of weeds, and he says, if we could rent your farm, we'd make it brown, and we lost a couple. Now we put sunflowers in, and when your landlords are 70 to 90 years old and they're single ladies or widows, and take them 6 or 8 sunflowers in a mason jar, about a month's worth of flowers every week, and refresh them. They think David can do no wrong. So we have not lost any more ground because of what they might call a weed patch. We began working with Steve Groth with tillage radishes in the early 90s. And this happens to be one of the radishes that we grow. The tuber is about 2.5 inches in diameter, about 24 inches deep. And then the taproot's another 36 inches deep. All of these plants go in after wheat. That's why they get so big. They have that extra 60 days to grow versus a corn and bean rotation. We just don't get enough time to get our cover crops to develop in the manner that we're showing pictures of today in that short window if you're in a corn bean rotation. And that's why I really like the cereals in there. We found out we could run the radish through a sugar beet plate with our white planter. You can do it with a Kinsey planter, or you can do it with a deer, it doesn't matter. So we put a row of radishes and a row of winter peas side by side. And the next picture, I think you'll see that. And there they are. In the spring, everything's dead because usually the winter peas are over knee high and they will frost off in the winter. If they're less than knee high, they'll survive the winter and make it. Of course, the radishes will die because the ground freezes. Go back in the spring and plant your row of corn on that reddish row. That soil is loose and fluffy. And there's a lot of nutrients there in that row of radishes just because of that tuber. We also see earthworm population increase 3 or 4 fold by using radishes in our rotation. And the reason I like the radish, as you can see in this picture, as that radish grows and the tuber comes out of the ground, it actually lifts that soil 3 to 4 inches. Now imagine each one of those radishes being 4 to 6 inches apart. They're lifting the soil. So I have a natural strip till machine. I don't have to buy a piece of iron. I don't have to pull it in the field, but we actually have strip till done from our radishes when they decompose over the winter. And they do hold a lot of nutrients. So this was a study that we found from our winter peas and crimson clover. Dr. Lafique Islam from Piketon did the study for 5 years on our farm, and this was the pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, sulfur, calcium, magnesium he found at planting time out of 5 different fields. So we had 20 fields involved in the study. So I could count on what we could see here as the nutrients we need for corn for next year. So that's why I say we can learn to reduce our nutrients, because if you look where he was showing, we had 250 pounds of nitrogen, we had 23 pounds of phosphorus, we had 230 pounds of potash, which is enough to grow 200 bushel corn without adding any bought fertilizer to make those plants produce a healthy crop of corn. You also notice we picked up 120 pounds of calcium, which means on our home farm, we've not limed our home farm since 1971, and we still have a pH reading of 6.8 and 6.9. How important is the 3-year rotation? I feel it's real important. It gives me spring money or summer money to harvest. To me, I think wheat, small grains are easy to harvest. The header's off the ground. You don't have to worry about rocks jumping in the combine or anything like that. And you can just roll right along. Then you come back in and you plant your cover crop in behind that, get it to grow big. And like the radish slide before, you take the value of those nutrients there will more than surpass a 30 bushel soybean crop in return on your investments, but you don't have to spend. After the wheat crop, we go in. This happens to be one of our mixes called the scavenger mix. It has 10 different species. And what we're doing here is scavenging the nutrient was left over from the wheat crop. So if it didn't use all the nitrogen, or if it had extra phosphorus or potash, these cover crops will pick it up. And here you see sunflowers, sun hemp, spring, summer sorghum sudan, pearl millet. Underneath there, then there's crimson clover, winter pea, hairy vetch, flax, and those are our cover crops in this field. And this is a September 23rd picture, and this was planted on July the 28th. So you can see it really grows well, and there's about 24,000 pounds of biomass in this picture. We talked about planting green. Some years it really works well. If you can remember some years back, in 2017, it was a warm spring. It warmed up early in March. The cover crops grew extremely well. They got big. And here we're planting corn, and you can see how well the planter lays down the cover crop. The planter goes right through it. We don't have any trouble covering it up. We use a crop roller behind there to crimp it. When we can crimp it, it'll actually die. And here we can get by without any chemicals or any bought fertilizer in 2017. If you remember 2018, it was cold clear up till about the 5th or 6th of May. The cover crops are only about 5 or 6 inches tall. So that means we have to change our management strategy. So this year we had to use some burn down. We had to use some starter fertilizer. We had to use some nitrogen, just because the cover crops did not get big enough that we could use a crop roller on. In 2018, the crop roller never was in the field. It's set in a barn and never was used. But those are the things that you have to learn, and management is the key to making regenerative agriculture work for your advantage. This was a field that was in CRP for 10 years. We were able to rent it before it came out of CRP. I worked with NRCS. They said, David, you're going to have to plow it because there's all kind of stuff in there. I said, I'd like to have permission 65 days before the contract ended to go in, and we used Roundup on everything that was in there. And there was everything from little baby trees to blue stem and all that stuff after a 10-year program. So we sprayed that all off with Roundup, come back in with a 10-way species, planted that in there, and we're rolling the crop on the 27th day of May, right there. It was so tall and big, the corn planter had trouble with the marker arms breaking the shear pin, so we rolled it ahead of the planter. And we did not use any fertilizer or nitrogen on that field the first year, and we produced 196 bushel of corn and no erosion. I really get upset when I see 10 years of CRP and you've kept the erosion to almost zero, and then a guy will plow it or chisel it or do something, and they lose more soil the first year than they saved the whole 10 years that the government paid him not to farm it. You know, do you get results? Here's the results of the corn growing through that residue after 10 years of CRP. Look how nice and green that corn is. You see no leaf damage. You don't see any flea beetles. You don't see any corn problems with it, and it's just doing well. The things that we see that works really well and with our cover is the soils are cooler. They'll stay damper. So the day we took this, the conventional soil was like 91 degrees. I think it says there 91.5, and our soils were 78. Our soils never got above 86 degrees that whole year with all that thatch on there, and the corn never suffered for any moisture. Again, I just wanted to show you what it looks like at planting time. We just broke for lunch. My grandson came back 2 years ago to help me on the farm, so we have a white planter like we talked about. We went to lunch, and the neighbors were all in the field with John Deere planters and those kind of things. And we come back, and Chris was just starting with me. He says, "Grandpa, why don't you have a green planter?" And I said, "Well, you know, if we went to lunch and come back, we probably couldn't find it because the cover crop would have grown through it and covered it up." But that's really not the excuse, but it made it sound good, you know. How do you plant green? This picture just shows you how easy it is. The policy on Dave Brandt's farm is you never be in a field after you plant the cover crop till you plant the corn. Anytime you got a mark in the field, that's what you follow. If you look over the top of the cab, you can see where the marker arms laid that rye and hairy vetch and crimson clover, so you don't have a problem. We don't have guidance on a tractor. I would love to have some, but just haven't spent the money for it. But I guess we don't worry about putting fertilizer on. We don't need it. So we don't have anything that tracks in the field other than deer. And every now and then you'll follow a deer track instead of a marker arm, you know. Some real fun things we're doing. We're working with Ohio State University to figure out whether our corn has more digestible protein than conventional corn. So here was a study we worked with them where we used no fertilizer on a field of corn, and it protested 9% protein. We put half rate on part of the field. We lost 1% of protein and went to 8.6. We put full rate on, which my agronomist has a fit because we don't use anything, went down to 7.5. And our neighbor's conventional corn, I don't know whether it was the same variety or not, but it was only testing 5. You know, so 9.1 protein means an increased value of the grain, which means it takes less protein to feed the livestock. It has more amino acids in it. And I think down the road, we'll find out if cattle eat healthier commodities, the meat's going to be more healthy. And then when I eat the meat, I become more healthy. So I think that may be a real thing we need to think about and talk about, you know. People ask us, is there a lot of, can you make any money using regenerative ag practices? Well, here's our cost of production in 2018. And that was the year that I showed you the picture. So we had to use some nitrogen and some starter fertilizer. So we put our cover crop cost in from the wheat after wheat harvest. So it cost us $25 an acre for this 10-way species. We used non-GMO seed corn, which cost us $66.81 an acre. We had to use a little burn down because the crop roller didn't work. It wasn't tall enough. So we had $9.75 in our herbicide program. We had $28.24 in NP and K bought for the year. The $55.08 is my grandson's on a computer program that keeps track of all the fuel and the oil and the repairs and the tires everything else that we do, and that's the actual cost per acre of that equipment going across the field. The cost us, our average cash rent's $150 an acre, or a total outlay of your pocketbook of $334.85. In 18, the corn was worth $3.11. It took 107 bushel to break even. Our yield in 18 over all of our acres was 192 bushel, 0.9. So we made $261 an acre profit to pay fixed cost and have profit left. Not too bad a return in 18. Told you grandson's really good with the computer. This is supposed to be a yield map. I don't care what it really yields. I want to know whether each cell in this field is making us money. So this is a return per acre map. So if it's green, we're making good money. If it's light green, we're making less. If it's kind of orange, we're making less. And if it's red, we're just breaking even, or we're losing our bottom, you know. The right angle piece you see on the left happens to be a waterway, and that's why it showed up green there. The waterway or red, the waterway, and other places where Grandpa didn't let the corn planter down fast enough, or we had a gap in the field. We talked about insects, and this happens to be my favorite insect. This is called a crabbed beetle. This guy can eat his body weight in slugs every night as long as he lives. You know, he'll probably eat 15 or 20 slugs every night. We have about 6 to 7 of those per acre that we can find. There's probably more than that, but that's what we've been able to find. They also eat foxtail seeds and giant ragweed seeds. So actually we have a natural herbicide thing here that's helping us with our weed control also. If we happen to use seed corn treatment, like a neonic on our seed, and the slug crawls over the neonic, and this insect bites the slug to kill it, the neonic will actually kill this crabbed beetle in about 30 seconds. You'll find him kicking and roll on his back and die. Lots of ways to plant corn. We can plant it brown if you like to plant brown. The problem is our weatherman, we don't pay him enough, because when we kill a field that looks like this, we usually get about a 2.5 or 3 inch rainfall, and then it stays wet all summer because the wind and the air, and we have no tile to draw out the water. So it becomes a big bowl of jello, and it just never does dry out. So that's why we've learned not to do this. If you're on sandy soils or sand soils that tend to dry out quick, you'll want to learn to kill your cover crops before it sucks all the moisture out, because it can do that also. I like to plant green. We've talked a lot about that. So here we're planting green soybeans with our planter. I borrowed this slide from Rick Clark. He's over on the Indiana-Ohio border. He's a great no-till organic farmer, but I wanted to show you here in this chart that I thought was really interesting. If we look at 28-inch tall rye, and he sent the rye off and had it analyzed to know what was there, they found 134 pounds of nitrogen, 64 pounds of phosphorus, 281 pounds of potash, 10 pounds of sulfur, 12 pounds of magnesium, 32 pounds of calcium, and he had 6,800 pounds of green biomass. Just imagine that amount of nutrients was in that crop, that field, to plant that corn in. What a blessing that is for the next crop. We're going to change gears a little bit and talk about planting soybeans and rye. This is a piece of cake. This is fun. You plant the soybean or the rye after corn to go into beans. Plant directly into the rye. This just happens to be some that was burned off. It wasn't rolled, and the beans were coming up through it, and it works pretty well. I prefer to roll after we plant to get it down on the ground so the beans can come through a little better. They don't get spindly. If you leave the rye tall, the beans tend to get a little spindly to start. It takes them a little bit longer to get up through the canopy. But the neat thing of it is, here's that field of corn, or field of beans. We rolled the rye, no herbicide, and in 13 we made 72 bushels an acre. Our cost of production here is $9 for cover crop, non-GMO seed at $42. No nitrogen. The equipment cost is less because all we use is a combine, a drill, and a crop roller. Rent's the same, $235 an acre out of pocket cost. It was worth $8.40, took 28 bushels to break even. We made $369 out of pocket cost. Nice return on those fields. Again, a yield map. The yield map on the right is 50 years of no-till. You'll see that little white diverted line in the center. And on the left is a brand new farm we bought 4 years ago. We've got a long way to go to make the field we bought as profitable as the one that's on the right, but we're coming on it. Some ideas, some things we do. I think if you're going to use cover crops, you'll need to learn how to pick out your herbicide or your varieties. So here was a variety check we did in 18. What I wanted to show you is we have 211-day varieties of corn. There's the variety numbers. Here's the yield, 131 and 185. But over here's what's interesting. For variety only, nothing else changed. In cover crops, one variety made $59 an acre versus $228. Next year, guess what? There was none of that variety planted on Dave Brandt's farm because it just can't make you any money, But the seed companies do not know that, So that's why I think you need to test this on your own farms to find out what varieties work well for you. We have the ability to go in and sow cover crops and standing corn. We have a high boy sprayer with a Montag seeder on it. We can blow 10 different cover crops on 36 rows at a time. Really a nice way to do it. We get pretty decent results. I think it's better than an airplane. It's not as fast as an airplane. It costs about the same to do it as a plane does as far as cost per acre. We're working on learning how to do it when corn is going to be in the 4 to 6 to 8 leaf stage. We've had some success, but we still have to learn how to manage our herbicides better, or what we use so our herbicides don't kill our cover crops as we're trying to interseed them into cornfields that you're using herbicides in. But some of the results are really nice. This is a clover field, the clover stand where we're going back to corn, and some rye in there growing. If you happen to have livestock, you can shell this corn and then put the cattle in there and get lots of pounds of gain till fall comes. This happens to be hairy vet or rye and radishes. Our high boy cedar, you can see how nice a stand we got. This was a soybean field that we put crimson clover, hairy vetch, and winter pea in. With the high boy, it was about 3 inches tall when we cut. This is 2 weeks after it's cut. Now it's a solid stand. So we actually gain about a month's growth by doing this earlier with the initial crop that you're trying to harvest standing in the field. And then here's rye growing real well, I want to show you this picture because I think we need to talk about how to mimic Mother Nature. If you look at the woodlot directly behind my hat there, that's our woodlot. And you can see it's different heights, trees, different varieties. So if you look at the field where I'm standing, we got the same thing. We've got plants that's 5, 6 foot tall. We got plants that's 3 inches tall. So we got diversity, and we're building diversity in the soil, which means we build diversity in the roots. And we have root depths clear down to 5 to 6 foot deep, when it can grow like this. Here's really the good way to manage those crops. Get them out there. They'd be putting these cattle in September, late August, 1st of September. This happens to be Green Acres down in Cincinnati. They've done a lot of research with their cover crop blends. They're showing between 3.5 to 4 pounds daily gains on these animals, and they're happy and they do really well. You can see how well they like it. You can barely see the cattle in there when you first turn them in, and they learn how to eat that really well. We also sell crop rollers. We go from a 3-footer like this one for backyard gardeners. If you can't afford that, I can sell this one to you. That happens to be my son. He's got a 4-foot one there with a 1-inch angle iron boulder to it, 2 rubber bungee cords. does the same thing as that $700 one you just saw in the previous picture. Now it's time to have fun, to talk about how to figure out whether you need to grow corn or other things. This happens to be a 50-year-old sod that we was able to rent. It's like on 6 acres. It's close to a housing project. So here we're planting pumpkins. This is a AC planter unit. I put a seed on it. There's a funnel you can see there. He's got a 5-gallon bucket of pumpkin seeds between his legs. There's a red mark on the press wheel. When he saw the red mark on the press wheel, he threw 2 pumpkin seeds in there. The fellow was complaining at 10 o'clock he was getting hot, so I gave him air conditioning. We broke for lunch, come back for lunch. We couldn't get the planter to go in the ground, so we transferred the 250-pound weight and put the 400-pounder on it, and it worked well the rest of the afternoon. You know, but what kind of results can you get when you do this? Here's my lovely wife looking at the amount of pumpkins that we were growing in this field. And right back here is the reason why. There was 450 brand new homes on 200 acres that we did farm 2 years before. Now this 9 acres of pumpkins gives us about as much money as that 200 acres did when we was growing corn. Just wanted to give you a shot of our soil pit. In 1971, our soils was all yellow, like right here. This is 24 inches deep in the soil. This is 20 inches deep here, what I'm going to call 6.5 to 7% organic matter soils. And we've built that over the 35 or 40 years we've done with cover crops. My goal in the next 5 years is to have it totally black, 48 inches deep with the roots that we're doing. The biggest thing we've seen with our cover crops, we're able to bring mycorrhiza back that you can see. This is a biscual mycorrhiza. This is what actually, you can see the roots here. This is actually bringing nutrients to these roots. When you plow and disc, you disturb this and it evaporates or gets burned off because of the oxygen going in the soil. And it's very hard to find a biscual mycorrhiza in conventional soils. Most conventional soils are highly bacteria driven. Soils that have cover crops are balanced with bacteria, nematodes, and all the other protozoa that make the plants more healthy. Last couple slides I got, just want to show you what cover crops can do. Look how clean the water is on the right hand of the picture. And on the top left, you'll see the neighbor's field coming off with their mud. This is an 80-acre field of cover crops. This has to be ours. This is going across the road to a tile ditch. This is the amount of water coming off an 80-acre field after a 2.5 rainfall event that happened took a half an hour to get 2.5 inches in 2017. Same day, right across the road, the same 80 acres, but look at the amount of silt that's leaving this farm. You know, I thank you very much for letting me speak to you and talk to you, and I will try to answer any questions you have or talk about anything you'd like to talk about. So thank you very much.